Today we're having a conversation with Tim Smith. We're talking Mars Hill Church and the importance of the church gathering together in worship. Welcome to the To Be the Church podcast, where we explore what it looks like to truly be the church in today's culture. I'm Tyler, and Ben and Andrew, they're gone still. And so we have a very special guest today. Today's going to be really fun because we have Tim Smith with us. Tim, thanks for being here.
Hey.
Yeah, and so if you're a part of NGC, you know Tim because he's been helping us out with musical worship for, how long has it been now?
You know, I was just thinking about it because it seems like it's been a while, but the first time I led was like a little before Thanksgiving last year, so it hasn't quite been a year yet.
Not quite, yeah.
Yep.
I remember the Christmas season. You were super involved in that. So it was we're getting to the year point, or at least we're close. So a couple more months we'll be at the year point. And so, yeah, we just want to sit down today and have a conversation. You have a fascinating past and like a really exciting future. That's a really corny thing to say, but I just thought of it just now, and it fits.
Totally.
But yeah, so I thought we'd just talk about your story a little bit. And so, you're, from this area-ish originally,
Yeah.
Right?
So I grew up in Portland. It's getting to be more and more rare to meet people that actually grow up in the area, right? But I grew up in Southwest Portland, kind of where Portland and Tigard and Beaverton, kind of in the suburbs to the west, all come together. I grew up there my whole life. The only other place I've lived than the Portland metro area is St. Louis for about 18 months, and then Seattle for about 12 years, and then I moved back to Portland. But yeah, I grew up in Southwest Portland, part of a Christian family. Grew up mostly around church. We had some like little times here and there where we weren't quite as involved in a local church. But for me, like faith really became real as I kind of got into middle school into high school. Was a part of a church called Southwest Hills Baptist in the Beaverton area over there, and had a great youth pastor. And as I kind of got into middle school, I got to know this guy well. His name was Kurt, and he was a big influence on me. And he was that guy. It's probably still common in a lot of smaller churches these days, but it was super common then to have somebody that was like part-time youth minister, part-time worship leader or worship pastor kind of person. And that was his role. He kind of did both of those things. And man, I just love this guy, and he really poured into me, and God really just moved in my heart, particularly through gathered worship. I was raised to know a lot of true things about God, but something happened as we started to gather and started to sing, like true things I knew kind of crossed over, I think, more into things I was actually experiencing. And so Kurt, my youth pastor, he encouraged me to just pursue music more. I loved music, and like all good youth pastors, he had an extra acoustic guitar that he loaned to me and taught me all 3 chords that I needed to play all of our songs, right? And that's how I got into music, and I started leading worship probably around age 16 or 17, and so, I'm 47, so wow, that's, I guess it's been about 30 years in one way or another that I've been leading people in worship through song. So I married a gal from Estacada, Oregon. If you don't know where that is, it's like a little town on the Clackamas River, kind of 45 minutes-ish southeast of Portland. And not long after we got married, we moved to St. Louis, Missouri, and I was a youth ministry intern. I didn't really necessarily aspire to be a youth pastor, but it was a good opportunity to live somewhere else, and I wanted to be in ministry more vocationally, and it was a great opportunity for that. I learned a lot through that, and partway through the time in St. Louis, I went to this conference, and I can't remember the exact name of the conference, but it had a lot of things, like a lot of things did in these days, like in the late 90s. I think the word Gen X was in the title. I think the word postmodern, something about a new generation was involved in the title. And partway through this conference, I met a guy named Mark Driscoll who had planted a church in Seattle. And as we talked, and as I listened to some of his talks, I was just really attracted to a lot of what he had to say. He was looking at where the church was in that day and kind of critical of some things that my friends and I were also critical about, some more of the established church, particularly in the day of the late 80s into the 90s, church growth movement. Willow Creek was kind of being exported as a church growth model to everyone under the sun. And Driscoll didn't come from the church. He came to Christ later in life, and he just told all these stories about people coming to Christ in his church plant that was about a year or so old at that point. And when I thought back over the years, man, I just thought I'd seen a ton of youth group kids rededicate their life to Christ at camps and such, myself included. But man, I had seen so few people who didn't come from the church actually come to know Jesus. And I wanted to be around something like that. I wanted to be a part of something like that. And we also wanted to kind of get out of the Midwest. It was an interesting experiment, but it didn't stick. And we wanted to get back to the Northwest. And so in 1999, it's actually almost exactly 20, oh my goodness, it'll be 23 years. This week, it was like mid-August of 1999, we rolled into Seattle, into the Driscoll family's driveway, and lived in their basement for a bit. And the church was like 200 people, about 2 years old, meeting in a rented place, meeting in this big old historical Presbyterian church at that time. And man, when I got there, I wanted to be involved in ministry, but for me, I didn't go to seminary. I didn't really see myself as a pastor. I thought that pastors were a lot more, what I identified with that was just a lot more like trained religious professionals, and I wasn't really that guy. I'm not sure I really aspired to be that guy. And so, I mean, one of the last things I thought it would be was a pastor. I just wanted to get involved in this church and like volunteer in the bands. It was the day of the Microsoft, kind of the heyday of the Microsoft intern, where so many guys were, making six figures, working in their pajamas in a basement or a tiny apartment somewhere. And so I was like, I'm gonna see if I can become an intern at Microsoft, and maybe someday they'll let me play in the band at Mars Hill. And I ended up getting involved right away. I became an intern there, and eventually I became the first worship pastor about a year later that Mars Hill Church ever had. When I came to Mars Hill, I'd never been in a band. I'd never owned an electric guitar. It was kind of like acoustic guitar, sandals, flannel, 3 chords for the Lord. I had kind of longer hair and a big kind of David Crowder looking goatee, although I didn't know who David Crowder was at the time, but it was a little bit like that, a little bit of a goat boy kind of vibe, with some good like Northwest granola kind of thrown in for fun. Yeah, man.
And what did the church look like at that time?
Yeah,
we all kind of know, or maybe we'll talk about it, like what Mars Hill became at some point.
Totally.
But like, what did that look like? Was it? I mean, you talked about meeting in the Presbyterian building.
Yeah.
Was it still very like church plant startup phase, where it's like, oh, we're setting up chairs, there's a couple hundred people here. What did that look like?
Totally. Yeah, it was a big historic Presbyterian church that was built, I think it was built in like the later 50s, 60s. It had this real modern kind of feel inside. The outside was cement, the inside was marble. Had just atrocious acoustics. And we set up our own sound system. Every week we'd come in, they did church in the morning. We would come in the afternoon at like 1 or 2 and set up our own sound system and a full kind of more like rock band, like drums, bass, acoustic guitar, electric guitar, some vocals. There was a guy who would occasionally, play some hand percussion. There was occasionally a didgeridoo that we eventually came to be called the didgeridoo. There was incense and candles that we would set up. There was like a whole crew who made candles week in and week out. And so we tried to not use the overhead lights. So it was kind of more dimly lit. It wasn't particularly liturgical. Driscoll was kind of getting his feel for being a preacher, and most of what that meant in those days was super long. I mean, there were sermons that went an hour and a half sometimes. It was usually an hour-ish. And then we played music with drums in this big, giant, echoey marble room that was, the poor sound guys trying to to bring a decent sounding mix out of that. But it very much felt, to your question, like very much felt like a church plant. It was very much still in that church plant phase of like, who are we? What are we becoming? They ended up at that building, just as a case in point. It was a few weeks before I arrived in town, and they just like abruptly, this other church building they were meeting at in another part of town, just kicked them out. They just decided, for whatever reason, I don't remember what the circumstances were because I wasn't there, but they didn't want him anymore. And with no notice, just said, you can't meet here this week. And Driscoll was at a pastor's prayer gathering thing and just threw it out as a prayer request. And the people at First Pres were like, oh, you can come meet at our place. And so, but just imagine what would happen like that in a church plant phase. If with 1 week notice, you lost your space, had to change spaces, and then just think about it. It's even hard for me, even though I was very much alive in this time, but pre-internet.
Yeah, communicate that with everybody.
Yeah, pre-internet, pre-text message.
Yeah.
You know, like mobile phones weren't even that common. They were starting to become more common in these days, like in the end of the 90s. So you know, there's like email. We built one of the first websites for a church, but yeah, they lost like 100 or more people in that transition because they couldn't get the word out, you know. Eventually some people found it, but yeah, it was very much like a church plant, very scrappy. The ethos at the time was we never wanted to be a large church, and if we ever got over like a few hundred, the idea was to plant more churches. Obviously that vision changed over time. We were involved in planting a lot of churches, but obviously Mars Hill grew very large as well. So yeah, it was an amazing thing to be a part of. I will always remember those early years in particular, just so formative. Like week in, week out, we ran one of the only all ages concert venues in the city at the same time. And so we had a couple different locations, and one of them was this concert venue that was like all kinds of shows, but mostly like punk and hardcore, because that was what the all ages kids like didn't have anywhere else to go in more like 21 and over type clubs. And so there was a lot of that, but then, you know, we supplemented that from all kinds of other bands. Some of the bigger shows I remember was like Death Cab for Cutie played at our venue when they were just still kind of like an indie rock band. Wow. from Bellingham. Pedro the Lion played there. Starflyer 59, the 77s, the Choir, some other like Christian groups in more of that Christian alternative scene from the 90s. But it was mostly just mainstream, occasionally hip hop. But just a lot of punk and hardcore. But it was this amazing few years of just figuring church out and being immersed in the music scene there. It was hugely formative for me, and so thankful for that experience.
Yeah, and how old were you when you went to Mars Hill?
Yeah, so let's see. When I got to Mars Hill in '99, I would have been 24.
Okay.
Yeah. So
yeah, super formative years.
Yeah, and then the year Mars Hill died, I turned 40. So it was like half my 20s and all my 30s were a part of Mars Hill. So I was there in Seattle. I was kind of like the central worship pastor as we grew and grew. Eventually we started spreading out into more of a multi-site church. And there just came a point where you're either going to start doing music in some kind of like streaming distributed kind of way, or you're going to have bands at each location. And we definitely chose the latter. We didn't see any good examples of the other option. And that kind of puts a bit of a limit on how far you can go as a central leader, because either you're going to have eyes on all the different locations and then you're not going to lead much, or you're going to lead and you're not going to be able to go see the other places. And so there was this kind of natural fork in the road with having a kind of a central worship pastor. And once it reached that fork, it was kind of a transition for me. And out of that, long story short, I ended up coming back to Portland in 2011 to plant Mars Hill Church Portland. And so let's see, that was in July 1 we got of 2011 is when we came back. So I guess that's been about 11 years now, which is wild.
Yeah. So a lot of people listen to this, like have this context of Mars Hill and they know this whole story. There's like an entire like 12-hour podcast about it, and that you're featured on a lot actually. But But some people might not. And so some people might be like, wait, a church in Seattle like started a Portland location.
Yeah.
And so like Mars Hill just like exploded, right?
Yes.
Mark Driscoll, the guy you mentioned, he became this massive celebrity, kind of polarizing figure in the church world. And so there were a bunch. Do you know how many Seattle campuses there were, or Seattle area campuses there were?
Let's see. At the height, we were 15 locations in 5 states, but we didn't have multiple locations in any other states. So New Mexico, Arizona, Orange County, and Portland. So probably 10, 11 in the greater Seattle area.
And then and like you said, it started going like where it was like became more of a West Coast thing. There's one in Phoenix,
and it wasn't most of the major transitions that we went through at Mars Hill as we expanded. They weren't very few of them were a big well thought out master plan. It was a lot of just kind of correcting and discerning as we went. We didn't really think necessarily initially that we would be out of the Seattle area, and then a church that we were friends with in Albuquerque, New Mexico, came to us and was like, what if we started having the video sermon here, and what if this happened, and what if we became a Mars Hill? And we're like, well, let's try it and see how it went. And then let's see, I think Orange County may have been next, or it was Portland. I can't remember the order anymore, but eventually we ended up in Albuquerque, Phoenix, Orange County, and Portland, outside of the Seattle area. So you had a local lead pastor or campus pastor, or we called them different things over the years. That was kind of like the face of the place, and occasionally they would preach, sometimes more, usually less. But and then everything else was more like a local church. But then the rest of the time it was video sermons via Driscoll being kind of beamed in. That's how it worked. If you don't know about how that kind of model works.
Yeah. So your responsibilities had to have changed drastically, right? Like from the Seattle days to starting Portland. So what was that like, and what kind of became your main responsibility?
Yeah, when I think back on it, it's really a deeply unsustainable model that is really geared almost exclusively around the Sunday event, just by nature of who it was. Because so most of the churches started by holding large events and then trying to pull people together from those large events. Portland was actually the most church plant-like church that started outside of the Seattle area, because we were allowed a lot more time to do it. So we started the church with community groups in January of 2011, and then we started monthly gatherings in like May-ish or the spring. Then we ended up getting a building, and started weekly in October, and then officially launched in January. Most of them started with Driscoll coming down and holding a huge event with whatever the best band was he could get together. And then, for 1 week, and you have like 1,000, 2,000 people show up or whatever. And then the next week it's like 500, and you can just imagine how that's a really different DNA that's going to begin from the beginning of a church. Portland really started with community groups, and there was a lot more of a community foundation to the church. And so it was myself and one other guy that were just kind of in it for everything, whether that's, meeting with people, rallying for the events. A lot of what we did was really build into community groups, and it was really exciting at first, but it grew so fast. By the time we started monthly gatherings, those were gathering, I don't know, a couple hundred or so. When we started weekly gatherings, it was 400. And then the first Sunday we had when we launched was like 6-ish. It grew to as many as like 8-ish, but on Easters we had as many as over 1,300 show up. And it was just me and one other guy on staff, and a whole bunch of volunteers. So you can imagine, like, a lot of the criticism of how we did things at the time was that, it's just kind of a Sunday event. And I hated that. I pushed back on it. And there was a sense in which it was more than that. We weren't just a Sunday only. And especially in Portland, we really had a strong foundation of community and relationship at our church. And yet there's still a very real sense in which that criticism was kind of right. It did feel more and more like a conference that met 52 times a year. So I I spoke at all the things. I was kind of the platform guy, speaking and leading worship. And then my friend Ryan kind of handled most everything else in terms of like details, finances, and admin and this kind of thing. And then together we tag teamed community group leaders, and that was about all we could manage in the midst of that. I mean, a staff of 2 for a church that gathers 700-800 a week is, in retrospect, it's kind of silly, like and like I said, deeply unsustainable. But it was a major, definite role change for me, where I've been mostly involved in music and production and the sound, light, and video volunteers and manning these teams and rallying for events. But there was a sense in which the way we planted Mars Hill churches, that it was kind of that, but just a bunch more. And part of why I really felt drawn towards it was I had a heart to just engage more in community with people and not just kind of live in the music and production world like I was a lot more in Seattle. So it was a big transition. There were some really great years initially with Mars Hill Portland. But then it was also, after those first couple of years, for the last year and a half of Mars Hill, it was just like kind of one escalating controversy, and it really degenerated down into I just felt like a firefighter. I was just kind of running around trying to hold everything together, both here and with a lot of things I was still involved with in Seattle. It wasn't good. And, you can hear more about that on the rise and fall of Mars Hill, the Christianity Today podcast. We don't have to rehash all that.
Yeah, those fires are well documented.
Yeah. The firefighting efforts.
So I don't know if I've actually ever told you this, but there was 3 times, I think, and maybe and I don't remember the exact years. I moved here in 2012, so about 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. There were 3 times that I came to Mars Hill, Portland.
Okay.
On Sundays, and
I think you told me at least one.
Okay, yeah. I have memory. Do you guys had a Sunday night service at one point?
At some point,
yeah. So one time I was off here, and so I was like, dude, I'm gonna go check out the Mars Hill Portland thing on a Sunday morning, and I think a couple of times I came on Sunday night. But you I remember one of them. You did everything except the sermon. It was like you welcomed people, you sang the songs, you did the announcements, you took the offering. It was just like, I don't even think you put your guitar down, except for the sermon. Like when it was the Driscoll video.
Right. Yeah.
But no,
the sound guys got cute. Got real quick at muting the effects. So I was I go from singing with some reverb, and then they got to mute it quick, so it's not like voice of God for calling for the offering and everything else. But
maybe a voice of God for the offering might be a good idea.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. We could experiment with it. We could try that here.
We give it a shot, especially with your voice, your deep, booming voice. But I remember thinking so I think the 3rd time I came to Mars Hill, Portland, it was kind of like things were escalating, and news was getting out about things escalating in Seattle and stuff like that. And I just remember thinking this is so odd that the actions of people, of a church leadership, or even a single person, maybe, I don't know, that's 3.5 hours away in a completely different state.
Yeah.
Is starting to impact the ministry that's happening right here,
right,
for these people. That's got to be tough. What was that like navigating? Through that?
It grew to be more and more of a disparity from kind of my experience and the general folk of Mars Hill, Portland. There was a handful of people at Mars Hill, Portland that had spent some time over the years in Seattle and may have met Driscoll or some of us, in person in those days. But by far, the majority of the people of Mars Hill, Portland had no personal connection to Driscoll. They saw him on a screen. In the life of Mars Hill, Portland, Driscoll only came in person twice, and it wasn't on a Sunday. It was for midweek events. And so by the time Mars Hill ended, the attitude of a lot of the people that were still at Mars Hill, Portland was hey, cool, now we just get to be our own church. This is going to be great, because we have our community. We love this. It's been a great experience for us. While me, when Driscoll resigned, I was the longest running elder and one of the, if not the longest running employee at that time. And so I had this just again, to say it was a formative experience is such an understatement. I never even really had much of a real job before this. Like I worked in warehouses. I taught little kids sports and wood shop classes at Portland Parks and Rec community centers, like wood shop for 4-year-olds. Like, this is a hammer and don't hit your finger, and like 6-year-old basketball. I'm not very coordinated. I have the height for basketball, just not the coordination. But I can do it with 4 to 6-year-olds. That was cool. But I mean, it was just so formative for me. I was so wrapped up, and it was so much of my identity. And so, by the end of Mars Hill, by the time Mars Hill as an entity ended, like, man, it was just, I was a wreck. I was a mess. But the people were like full of joy and energy and like, hey, this is going to be awesome, but it was definitely a chunk of people left along the way. And it was such a difficult thing to see what we had built come apart in a lot of ways. And for the last, month or two before Mars Hill really came apart and Driscoll resigned, I was very much a part of this investigation that was going on, investigating all these allegations that had come against Mark. And so for me, a lot of the people involved in that investigation were newer to the church, except for myself and 2 other good friends that had been there for a long time. There actually wasn't that many of us that had been on staff for a long time at the church by the end. There was a huge amount of turnover, as you might guess. And so it was this investigation process of like really having to come to grips with a lot of things that I had just kind of moved on from pretty quickly over the years. It was kind of like, Mark had this famous saying of like, get on the bus or you're going to end up under the bus or this kind of things. Well, it was kind of like digging up all the bodies, like all everybody left in the wake of the freaking bus, to use the metaphor, and revisiting so many of these things. And I just had to come to grips with like how much, I mean, there were things I was convicted of that I contributed to, but then I think even more so, there was just this deep feeling of like, I just kind of put my head down and pressed forward through so much of it over the years. And a lot of it for the sake of the church. Like there's these people, especially in Portland, like there's hundreds of people here. I can't get too wrapped up in all this other conflict and controversy. And yet, a lot of it you can't avoid. And so all that to say, it was a really tough time of kind of reliving a lot of the worst moments of the church until, Mark resigned, and we quickly made the decision that the options were find another central leader like Mark to be like the central video preacher for everything. And none of us thought that was a good idea. And all of our advisors said it was a bad idea. So we didn't even consider that. Secondly, was like try to hang together in some kind of coalition or network with maybe some shared services, some version of what Northwest Gospel has, and a lot of churches have, more autonomy to the local church, but still some like shared services and things that you have in common. But it quickly became clear from like the guys, the finance kind of guys, that wasn't particularly viable either financially, and we can find bookkeepers and such for a lot cheaper than maintaining this big central organization. And so it's like an hour, maybe an hour and a half conversation where we just like talk through options before like Mars Hill's over, and everybody who can will become an independent church. And from the time we decided that to the time when we had to be a completely separate entity, running our own payroll, running everything autonomously, was about 7 weeks.
Wow.
Yeah, 7 weeks to figure out, pick your name.
Like make your own 501c3 nonprofit, everything like that?
Which it's actually not enough time to do a 501c3. So almost everybody like just started as a general nonprofit org, and then over time, some went on to do the 501c3 process. But yeah, like become your own organization legally, get your bank accounts, like, set up payroll, decide who gets paid, like all of these decisions that happen as an organization. We had all, it's the opposite of the way organizations usually happen. We had all the people in this thing going, and then we had to flip and do all the background stuff. But yeah, it was a crazy time. It was, this year, this fall will be, it was around this time in 2014 when that investigation was getting going. So what is that?
8 years.
8. Yeah. 7, 8 years ago.
I think I've told you this before, but we have a lot of folks here at NGC that were a part of Mars Hill, either the Portland, or, a lot of people who've come down from Seattle.
Yep.
And talking with all of them, kind of when it happened, when stuff happened. And then, more recently when the podcast came out, that was like rehashing a lot of this stuff for a lot of folks. I found that kind of like you said, where you had a lot of folks that were just like, hey, this is our community. We love it. We're going to keep going. We just don't have the guy on the video anymore. I found that in my anecdotal experience with people that the spiritual and leadership, the spiritual health and the leadership development skills, I guess, of their primary discipler, dictated their experience at Mars Hill more than I think other churches that I've, watched go down in flames.
Yep.
And so somebody was at the Driscoll campus and a lot of them even walked away from the faith, and stuff like that. Whereas a lot of the folks I talked to in Portland who were under your care, and your team's care, they were like, yeah, that was a bummer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And it was like that was kind of where it ended. And so, I think that's fascinating. And what came out of that was a new old church, right?
Yeah. I came to kind of say, and I don't mean this as judgment categories for whoever decided what they were going to do, but I think there was a real sense in which, as Mars Hill ended, Mars Hill as a church had become kind of a mix of a church and a studio audience. And studio audience, I mean, is folk that aren't really very connected to the church, that are mostly there to just come on Sunday and just be a part of the event, in a sense. And this is why I think the Mars Hill podcast has been listened to tens of millions of times, because this kind of phenomenon of such a disembodied church has only grown to be more common since the end of Mars Hill, not less. And a lot of people have experienced these really large, very I just said disembodied, but just really event-centered churches, often built around a charismatic big personality, where to be a part of it primarily means to attend an event, which is really different than actually being a part of a people. And so I think as Mars Hill ended, each of the local churches kind of got a chance to see how much of who's been coming on Sunday was a studio audience and how much was a church that really felt like they belonged to people. And the most common dividing line between that, and not that, and again, I don't want to be too negative on this. It's not I don't say that being negative about anybody who decided they want to find another church at the end of Mars Hill, especially those who were coming from a long distance. I mean, at the height of Mars Hill, Portland, we had people coming from east as far as the Dalles, west as far as Cannon Beach, Seaside, coastal towns, south to Wilsonville, and north to Battleground. And so it's hugely spread out.
Hour to 2 hours each way.
Yes, exactly. And so we encouraged people there are good churches, in that hour drive, you're going to have a hard time connecting in a meaningful way to community at a church when you're driving an hour, And so a lot of, but still at the end of the day, there is this sense in which it kind of sifted out those who were driving a long ways, those who were just kind of coming for a big event or a better band or something like that, and those who really felt connected to one another. And the dividing line more times than not was, were they in a community group? And most of the people, almost everybody I can think of off the top of my head who's now at Northwest Gospel and who stayed from from Mars Hill, Portland to what it became afterwards. It was called Redeemer Church. Almost all of them were in a community group. That was our primary ministry, where you are known and know others. And we didn't do almost any other programs. Just to put a really high value on relationship and being known by one another. Because it's one thing to enjoy the Sunday event. It's one thing to feel like you connect to the preaching, feel like you're fed, as the spiritual term that people use, or it's another thing to like identify with the worship experience. But it's another thing to belong to a people where you know others and others know you, and they're in your life and have walked through difficult things with one another. And if there was a strength that we had that took us through all of the conflict and controversy, I think it was the fruit born out of being able to start that church in community groups. And that's a clear thread that runs through, that went from Mars Hill, Portland to Redeemer, and a lot of these communities still meet in some form or another. They might not be weekly now, but there's still like Mars Hill, Portland, Vancouver gatherings. There's a good chunk of folk here at Northwest Gospel, but other people who've landed at other churches and things. And so I think I'm encouraged in the sense that desire for more community and not just focusing on events as a pastor was part of what drew me back to Portland to be a part of starting that church. And that desire has really carried myself and so many others through. And there's a lot of really close relationships still. And I'm really grateful for that. I'm grateful for how God has worked and continues to work in that community, the diaspora of sorts, the spreading out of Mars Hill and locally, Redeemer.
Well, hey, it was important to us to be able to air this entire conversation with Tim. And this conversation ended up being over an hour long. And so we decided to split it into 2 parts. So we'll be back next Friday with part 2 of this conversation, where we talk a little bit more about Mars Hill, some of the creative culture there, and then what does life look like now that Tim is not there anymore, and the things that he's been doing since. And so next Friday, we'll see you wherever you're listening to this or watching this. We'll be back next Friday for part 2 with Tim Smith. See you then.